Let me begin by saying good morning to all of our AdNet Zero supporters out there in the world. My name is John Osborn, and I am your friendly U.S. Director for all things AdNet Zero here in the United States. But enough about me, because we have an extra special guest with us here today. Her name is Amy Williams, and she is the founder and CEO of GoodLoop. I might also add that Amy and GoodLoop are big supporters of AdNet Zero, and I've known Amy now for a grand total of about 6 months, but meeting Amy was a life changer for me in many, many different ways, and you're gonna get a chance to see and hear from her in just a little bit. This is actually an exciting first for AdNet Zero in the US, in that we are thrilled to have all of you out there with us here today. As you know, we just launched on February 7th, and we've got some terrific momentum here in the States. Back to the webinar, we're actually hosting these sessions to provide all of our supporters, not only here in the States, but wherever AdNet Zero is up and running, with exclusive conversations and insights into all things related to reducing carbon associated with the advertising ecosystem. Today, and that's why we're here today, Amy and I are going to be discussing a hot topic, no pun intended, and that is measuring your carbon footprint. Many of you are likely already familiar with all the great things that GoodLoop offers, but today we're also going to talk a little bit about how they operate as a sustainably conscious business and brand. Of course, you know, for all of us, measurement is certainly a critical component of carbon reduction. And after all, knowledge is power. I think we all agree on that. So this session here today is going to have actually 2 parts. The first part, Amy is unfortunately going to be subjected to my questions. And the second part is we'll hear from all of you. So if you've got questions, anybody that's tuning in, feel free to add them to the chat. And then as we round out our quick Q&A, we'll turn to some of those questions and we'll put them on the table to address. This is obviously, by now, if you haven't figured it out, totally informal and it's informational. We're all here to learn. That's an important part of this process. And hopefully all of these insights will really go towards job one. Job one for us is to inform actions that we all need to take as a group and as individuals as we look into the future and as we walk into the future. This is actually our first interactive webinar we've had, so bear with us if there are any technical difficulties. And with that as a backdrop, now we get to tune in to our fantastic guest, Amy. So Amy, thanks first and foremost again for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
No, it's great having you. So here's my first question. You know, you're new to the States. What's been the biggest sort of eye-opener for you making that big transition from the UK to the States? They can be funny anecdotal things or also just any other insights that you've gleaned in terms of making that shift.
Yeah, so I moved here on Friday, the 13th of January, which I think was a lucky omen.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I've been here kind of 2 months now. And to give some context, I started my company back in Scotland in 2016 and have been growing and building the business from the UK. We launched our first US campaign in May 2020 over Zoom. And for the last 2 years have been building the business, you know, on Zoom calls from our lounges. Because, you know, whether you were across an ocean or across the street, you were on Zoom during that time, right? So that was a very unique opportunity for the business, and we managed to kind of gain a lot of traction in the States, whilst also being totally unknown and weren't going completely under the radar because it was all, you know, one-on-one conversations. So now the world is starting to open up again. We decided that it was time to get some boots on the ground, namely my boots. So I have left a very capable and confident and brilliant team in London and moved here, and I'm now leading a team of 3 in New York. And the thing I've learned so far, well, I've learned a lot. Certainly, I'm really enjoying the frankness and openness within which Americans do business. There is an honesty and a directness that really simplifies things. You know, John and I, we were both at South by together recently, right? And any networking event in the UK, you've got to spend at least 25% of your time talking about the weather, minimum. It's like a national law. Whereas you go to South by, you walk up to someone, you say, hi, I'm Amy. This is what I do. This is what I could do for you. This is what I think I could help you with. Are you interested? And they go, yes or no. And then you move on, you know, and getting that level of simplicity, I think, is really powerful and empowering. And the other thing I've learned is Americans love karaoke. I have done so much karaoke in the last 2 months.
What's your go-to song? You know, everyone has a go-to. What's your go-to on karaoke?
Well, I've been doing American Girl for obvious reasons, just embracing my adventure.
I love it. Mine is Sweet Caroline. So if there's any Neil Diamond, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go. Now, look, I mean, obviously, so you talked about South by Southwest, and that was my first South by Southwest. And I got to be honest with you, it was kind of a mashup of like real strategy, you know, and insights, you know, around looking at and understanding and learning from what others are doing. But it was also serendipity. Like you, everybody I went up to and had conversations with, I walked away from those conversations, you know, uplifted and enlightened. And, you know, those are two key words, pivoting back to you, you know, enrichment and enlightenment. There are a lot of great things, not just good things about Good Loop. So bring us into your world and explain to us and to our listeners sort of what Good Loop does and how Good Loop can fit into and even change the advertising ecosystem.
Sure. So I started the business because I worked in the creative industry. I worked on the creative side of our industry. So I was making TV ads for fabric conditioners in Vietnam. And it was very glamorous at the time. And I was seeing a lot of brands producing beautiful, brilliant, purposeful creative. Unilever was a big client of mine, and they've obviously got this very clear structure of the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, where every brand has a role to play in society, a point of view on something bigger and more important than soap. And that is so exciting and such a big part of how we build brands today and how we choose what brands to buy, right? But then when you look at the media side of our business, which is typically like 90% of a brand's budget, not only is it not purposeful, but it also often is mired in negativity, you know, whether it's ad fraud or viewability issues or the carbon footprint, or just the 30% of the internet that use ad blockers because we've followed them around too much and we've pissed them off. You know, it felt like there was no real solutions on the media side of the landscape that were as purposeful and positive and respectful as the brands that bought it. So that was the sort of founding principle of Good Loop, was to build media products that were positive. And what we've been doing for the last 6 years since I started the company, you know, our beachhead sort of proposition is formats. So we have a ton of different formats like watch to donate, swipe up to donate, scan to donate. If you give an advertiser a bit of your precious time and attention, you unlock a donation and you can fund a good cause. And so we'll partner the brands with relevant causes, you know, working with Cadbury's, funding loneliness and supporting the elderly, working with Doritos with their Solid Black campaign, funding grassroots change makers in underrepresented communities, working with Quaker Oats, supporting Feeding America and getting food onto families' breakfast tables. We funded over 1 million meals with Quaker Oats last year. So that's sort of the bread and butter of the business. And all of that's been carbon neutral from day one. It's just something that I cared about when I started the company, and we are a B Corporation, so it's something that's important to your B Corp score. And part of being carbon neutral, you're on mute.
Amy, was that really the core impetus behind the start of Good Loop? Obviously, Good Loop is a company for good, but, you know, all the way back to 2016 when you founded this thing and you were just talking about some of the reasons why. Were those the reasons why, or was there something in your background, something in your experiences that really kind of pulled at your heartstrings in terms of making this your core reason for being, if you will?
Well, I remember... it's funny, there's never just one moment. It probably took a year of lots of little moments. And there's some really negative ones. Like I spent 3 days in a workshop about the meaning of freshness. And I came out of that feeling literally numb to the world. Like, how do you spend 3 days talking about the meaning of freshness? So there were certainly parts of me that were just like, this isn't important enough. But then also it's really important because, you know, we had this one product that used one less bucket of water per load of laundry. And if you think one less bucket of water, and it's, you know, maybe 3 washes a week, and this product was going out in Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Brazil, one less bucket times 200 million families is more water than I will use in my entire life. And I'm so proud of the charities we've supported and the money we've raised. But the thing I'm really proud of, the thing I really love about Good Loop, is helping big global businesses who move like oil tankers make tiny, tiny changes in the right direction. But because of their scale and their influence, the ripples are felt throughout the world. And that is something I think we all, you know, in AdNet Zero on this call and in our industry, I think we all have that power. And that's quite exhilarating.
I completely and totally agree with you on that. You and I have had several sidebar conversations along those lines. And I do note that last year, you guys at Good Loop announced the launch of your very own green technology products, helping other advertising businesses measure and mitigate their impact. And I'm curious, and I'm sure others would be as well, as to how that came about. And was this a hard or significant pivot for you and your previous business model?
Oh man, we've been on such a journey, and you know, as you said, John, like we're still learning together. You know, that's why AdNet Zero is so important. So our journey started, about 3 years ago. So we'd just got our B Corp certification. As part of that, we had to do our Scope 1 and our Scope 2 emissions. And there was this glaringly obvious gap, which was our Scope 3 emissions, which was the advertising we bought, the media we bought. I Googled it. I literally Googled it. What is the footprint of buying an ad online? And there was no answers. But what there was this open source tool where you could measure the carbon footprint of websites. And I did some reading about how they calculated it, and it was all on data transfer. How much data is transferred for this website to go live, and then how much electricity does it use to transfer that data? That was it. And I thought, well, that's kind of similar to what we do. So we took that methodology. I spoke to a few different universities and experts and got a couple of different opinions, and we started to formulate a methodology. It really wasn't complicated. It still isn't really that complicated. It's just data transfer, how much electricity is used, and then how much carbon dioxide has that electricity produced, right? We open sourced that, we put it on our website, and overnight, it became the most visited page on our website. Like it really, it really was a light bulb moment for me of, we did this thing to solve a problem for ourselves, but it's a question others were asking. And I think that's like the entrepreneur dream, right? That moment, that light bulb, that moment of, hang on a minute, I think we've solved a problem. So we started to think about how we might sort of offer that methodology to others. Obviously it is open source, but it's manual. So we've put it into an ad tag, just like a viewability tag, but for the planet. And have been using that to sort of measure the carbon footprint of other people's advertising for the last 18 months or so. We've learned a lot, and we keep improving it and working with partners, but we've made some progress.
And is all of this now coalescing in this impact report that you've been working on? Is that where that comes into play?
Yeah, so the impact report is something we publish once a year, and it's broader than just that. So we also report on things like our gender pay gap. We report on the multiple of salaries between lowest and highest in the company. We report on we're looking at things like our advertised emissions, which is the emissions of the stuff we've sold, right? And that's something that I'm working on with purpose disruptors. But also, our footprint, how much carbon is in the atmosphere because of the ads that we have run and because of the ads our clients have run. And that, frankly, is Pandora's box.
Yep, absolutely. So taking that as a thread and going back to our earlier conversation about some of your learnings coming into the US market, based on all you've seen and heard, and caveat being it's still early days, where do you think US advertisers should be focused today? What are some of the early steps that are important to get right early in the sustainability process, recognizing it isn't as simple as flicking a switch and all of a sudden everything's perfect? It's a journey with a destination, but give us some insight into that.
I definitely get the sense that there are brands and advertisers that are concerned about, I've heard this phrase, a carbon tax, quite a bit. It's just another thing we're going to have to pay for, and who fits the bill? Whose responsibility is this, and who's going to pay for it? That's the conversation that often I hear it framed as, especially here in the States. And I think it's a really interesting conversation, right? Because everyone has their own little piece of responsibility. The publisher has responsibility for their pages, their ad tech stack. The user has responsibility for their device. And similarly, I think, each of the vendors in the supply chain, of which there are many, all have to think about their own footprint and their own little piece of this. But equally, trying to pass the buck or trying to figure out how we slice up responsibility and cost is a very industry way of thinking about it. And I've had a lot of clients ask us, look, what are the trade-offs? How much is this going to cost me? Because we might be willing to pay for it. We might be willing to sacrifice some performance. We might be willing to do those things, but we just don't know what you're asking of us yet. And I think that's fair pushback, but I think we honestly don't know yet. We don't know what the trade-offs will be. We don't know what the solutions will be. There are some really exciting early evidence to suggest that things like SPO, where we're creating efficiencies in the supply chain, also create efficiencies from an emissions perspective, also increase, things like direct connections to publishers, which is going to increase funding to quality journalism. There's lots of early evidence of quite exciting mutual benefit, but there also will be a cost. There is an eventual residual emission that will need to be offset. Offsetting costs about 0.0003% of total campaign costs. It's not expensive, and it's not the eventual solution, but it's a part of the picture we need to look at. The way I think the conversation is most helpfully framed is a learning journey, and that's why I think AdNet Zero is so important. Is that state of pre-competition, that state of the industry trying to figure out benchmarks and measurement. If you measure it, you start to know what good looks like, and you start to know what improvements could be made, and you start to understand what trade-offs you might have to think about, and who is going to fund what, and all of those questions that come down the line. So I think measurement is absolutely key. What to do with that data can be quite overwhelming. So we've worked with a lot of clients who, it's one thing to receive a massive CSV file with a big data dump of all the emissions of your ads you've ever run. To draw out conclusions and recommendations from that is really the thing that we're focused on at Goodloop, so that we can go, okay, we've started to do the measurement. Now, so what? What's some behavior change? What are some easy little wins to reduce and start to learn? So yeah, I think seeing it as a learning journey. Another thing I'd actually really encourage is you to remember, as an industry, we've done this before. Pick any one of the amazing things we've done in the past, like the conversation around ad fraud and brand safety. That went from an expose in the Times, which launched on the front page while everyone was at Cannes sipping their rosé 11 years ago. And now we have GARM, and we have viewability standards, and we have brand safety tools, and we have technology partners, and we have, everyone is now starting to understand its role in the industry. And you wouldn't think to run a campaign without a brand safety tag today. That's the journey we're on for sustainability, and so we can draw from that, and we can learn from that.
Yeah, I completely agree. You hit on a lot of really great things there. One of the things you hit on is sometimes what some perceive as the barriers toward progress. One barrier being, well, who's going to pay for it? To be sustainable isn't a free hall pass. We've got to share the load, so to speak, in terms of figuring out how that's all going to come into play. Another is, how to collaborate. We are an inherently competitive industry where everybody eats each other's own lunch. And yeah, the dynamic in the States might be less backstabby, more full frontal. You'll see the slings and arrows coming at you before they hit you. They won't come from behind. But, there is opportunity in a lot of these challenges as well. Let's hone in on another talk track, which is there are some critics out there that say, oh, well, the whole carbon offset thing, that's not relevant because it's not really net zero. And I think that goes back a little bit to what you were just saying. We are on a journey. This is not going to be perfect on day one. But are there other sorts of challenges and barriers that you can think of in addition?
Yeah, the offset one's worth touching on briefly, actually, because I think it's a really important and interesting one. So a way to think about it is, an airline. We see their vapor trails. We're familiar with how carbon intensive the airline industry is. So, an airline could be carbon neutral tomorrow if they just bought enough offset credits. They haven't had to do any of the hard work. They haven't had to actually reduce. They haven't had to look internally at their processes. They've just thrown money at the problem and funded offsets. And now there are different kinds of offsets as well, right? There are offsets where the natural offsets, which is primarily things like tree planting. You'll plant trees and they will naturally sequester carbon out of the atmosphere and draw it into the tree. But these have challenges. Trees burn down. There's a famous, hilarious example of a Coldplay forest. And they planted a forest as part of some big PR stunt. And then the forest unfortunately burned down and their whole campaign ended up more carbon intensive than if they'd never planted the trees. Trees aren't ideal. So that's kind of natural sequestration. Then there's sort of carbon prevention strategies. So you can fund a hydroelectric plant, which will replace coal fuel. So actually preventing coal ever going out into the atmosphere. Another very famous one is in many countries, people have open fires for cooking. If you fund cook stoves for those families and those communities, cumulatively, you can save a lot of emissions by reducing the number of open fires. So there's lots of carbon prevention projects. And then this final bucket is the kind of mechanical sequestration, which is machines that literally pull carbon out of the atmosphere. And there's some really sexy stuff here, like you can get diamond rings made out of carbon from the atmosphere and stuff like that. Wow. This is the most cost intensive, but also the most kind of efficient possible. So at Goodloop, we tend to focus on that middle one, carbon prevention offset programs. And there are others in the industry I know who work very closely with mechanical carbon sequestration. So there's lots in that space, and there's lots of nuance in that space. And I think that's important because there's often like is it good or bad, which isn't really getting to the nub of the issue. However, going back to that airline, what they really should do is, can they change their fuel? Can they change their engines? Can they improve their planes to make them more efficient? And importantly, the really tough question, should we fly less? And that's the difference between carbon neutral and net zero. Net zero is a reduction down at least 90% in the emissions that you produce. That is a net zero strategy versus in carbon neutral. And so the difference between those is often not really communicated. And I think to answer your question, are the challenges, one of the biggest challenges I see is the complexity of language. This is such a complex field, and you don't know whether you should say carbon neutral or net zero or what the difference is, or carbon positive or climate positive. There's so many terms and there's so many landmines and there's so much opinion on what's right and wrong, and none of us are climate scientists, we're advertisers. So I think just like admitting that this stuff is complicated, trying to simplify, trying to educate, I think your course is a great start. Because if we don't kind of get rid of some of the jargon, I think we're gonna lose a lot of people on the journey.
Yeah, and I think crystallizing it in real world scenarios, I think helps bring it to life in a much more simple and eye-opening way. So for example, I'm on a learning curve myself, with the various terminologies and this, that, and the other. But one of the core things that I've learned is usually when confronted with the following question, we do a lot about talking about big enterprise businesses. But a question I get asked often is, well, I'm an individual that's just one voice inside of a massive organization. How can I, as an individual, take the first step forward on this journey? And I oftentimes come back to travel. You just said it yourself. I mean, if we just took a look at our travel footprint as an individual or as an enterprise, there is so much savings of carbon that can be done just by flying less or traveling in different ways. And that has been a humongous, I mean, you know, when you switch from flying business class to like taking fewer trips or riding in the back of the bus, that is a huge drop in carbon that I've learned, you know, a humongous decline. But there are probably other ways individuals can kind of steer into this as well. Have you seen or heard of any anecdotal ways that people can take that first step forward?
From an individual perspective, yeah, I think travel is a really powerful one. And there are also lots of schemes where you can get your clothes repaired. I think fashion is another one where we as individuals have a big impact. And you know, I've actually noticed here in New York there's a lot more little mom and pop shop like tailors. You can get a rip on your clothing fixed and things. I think there's a bit more of a culture of that here. Which is really lovely, and yeah, embracing that sort of buy once, buy better. You know, that's the Levi's thing, right? Buy better, wear longer, and Levi's are a great example. You know, they use 95% less fresh water in their denim, and their denim lasts on average double the length of a normal pair of jeans. You know, they're a business I'm really proud to work with Good Loop. So supporting those sorts of businesses and thinking about your personal footprint definitely helps. But yeah, I'm more interested in what we can do professionally and still as an individual. I think you can you know, use your compost bin in your kitchen, but what you really can do is sit down with your peers at work and think about how your $10 million media budget has an impact on the world and how you could change your spend. If you're an agency or if you're a brand, if you're buying this stuff, you are the one carving demand. You are the one architecting the shape of our industry, because your money is going to flow to, you know, whoever you choose to work with. And if we can start to make sustainability a competitive advantage, if we can start to ensure that money flows to those businesses that are leaning into this conversation, then everyone will follow.
And that gets into my last question. But before we get there, I want to go back to your fashion commentary. You know, I'm not allowed to speak fashion. My wife doesn't allow me to, and the AdNet Zero people, because I mean, there's only so much you can work with when you're wearing something like this. But I think that you hit on something really important, is that there is an ocean of different groups, associations, individuals, all doing really interesting things. But on the flip side, you know, the good news is there's a lot of stuff that's starting to percolate. The bad news is, wow, that's a challenge. Everybody's out there doing something. How do we make sense of it all? So like, I tilt back to AdNet Zero. You know, you're a company that has been built from the ground up and you're on a mission doing what you're doing. AdNet Zero is an association trying to galvanize and unify the ad industry and all parts and parcels of that puzzle together to addressing lowering carbon associated with advertising operations. There are other groups that like take the IAB Tech Lab. You know, they specialize in driving innovation, particularly through that lens of technology. You know, how do these pieces start to mesh together to reach that collective big leap forward that we're all striving for? You know, the role of AdNet Zero next to a company like a Good Loop in a world in the US where there are other associations out there. I come back to this theme of like the power of we figuring out ways to collaborate and work together, but easier said than done. How's your experience been?
My experience has been one of like pushing on open doors. Everyone in the industry cares. It is an industry of passionate, creative people. We're very fortunate in that way. And so from the moment we started working on this, you know, as I say, you know, we open sourced this internal little tool we'd made. It was such a janky little thing we put on our website. Overnight, it became this really high traffic page on our website. We got loads of inbound leads of people just saying, I want to learn. What is this? Tell me more. There is a real appetite for this. You know, I think that we all feel a sense of responsibility and a sense of, you know, the power that we hold. So I've definitely had a very, very acute experience of collaboration and energy. You know, even the fact that AdNet Zero exists, like, let's just reflect on that for a moment. 18 months ago, it was a chat in a pub in London. And today it is a global initiative with every major holding company signed up to AdNet Zero by 2030. in 18 months. That is
Yeah.
phenomenal. And so, you know, it's easy to understate, I think, how much people care in our industry. What I have found to be really exciting is just where you find one individual, one person in an organization that's willing to be the champion. You know, find your cheerleader. We've got fantastic examples where we've worked, you know, there's a big holding group that we use, our ad tag is used on all of their display and video as default in the region of Australia and New Zealand. And so that means that we've got this fantastic wealth of data now. We've been measuring it for 6 months, default across everything. And it's, you know, it's just a little ad tag. It's just like a viewability tag. It measures and helps, and it spins up into this dashboard so they can see it by time of day, by region, by device, by creative, and they can start to play around. And now we're doing a ton of hypothesis testing. Like if you change from a JPEG to a WebP file, how does that affect things? If you cut these suppliers out, how does that affect things? If you change your time of day. And these hypotheses now we're starting to really learn, and we're starting to make really quite significant improvements in their footprint. It's super exciting, and it's because one individual, I can literally put a name to it. One individual went, right, I'm going to get a promotion on this, you know, like this is my thing, this is my project, and you know, frankly, a little bit of selfishness here is fine. Like, you know, we need a few people that are going to get famous from this. We need a few people that are going to be brave. And if you feel like you're on this call and hearing that, you know, what's the one piece of technology or the one idea or the one new innovation that you could take into your industry and really own, take to your boss, take to your team, and sort of be the champion and make it happen? It just takes one person.
I love it. That's so inspirational. Oh my gosh. You're like such a radiator, you know, a low carbon radiator. And that is awesome. I once had a boss that was like, you know, one of our core values is we look for radiators, not drains. You know, drains are people that walk into a room, both virtual or physical, and they suck the oxygen out of it.
Yeah, me on a hangover.
You bring it in. Absolutely. Yeah. It's awesome. I can totally get on board. All right. Well, thank you very much for answering my questions. Let's pause for a moment, and I'm going to invite Danielle Willett in, who hopefully, because I can't multitask, has been looking to see if any questions have come in. Danielle, can you hear me? There's Danielle.
Hear you. Great stuff, everybody. We do have a couple questions that have come in. One is, what are you doing to become a carbon neutral organization? Is there any life hack?
Yeah, so we've been looking at a few different ideas. So we have a travel policy now. You know, as John mentioned, that's a big factor. So wherever possible, we take the train. We have an office in London and an office in Scotland. So we banned flights between those offices. So that's all train. We've got the train to Mexico last year. We'll be getting the train to Cannes this year. I won't be, because there's an ocean involved, but just, you know, you've got to be realistic with it, but just making sure that you kind of filter out, just as a policy, as a blanket policy, you know, no flights under 2 hours type thing. That's been a good one. We've got rid of all swag. We don't do any, you know, t-shirts and pens at conferences anymore. What else have we done? We do a travel survey once a year, and then that goes into our carbon report. Trying to think. We use carbon neutral ad servers. Obviously, that's an easy one.
You know, while you're thinking, I'll just interject. This is breaking news, but Givesley, whose whole business is around, you know, reducing swag and totes and this, that, and the other, particularly around the holidays. So they have like season without swag that they put on. They're becoming involved as a supporter officially with AdNet Zero as well. So you're hitting on some really good, timely things here. Really nice.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Givesley. So yeah. I mean, I'll have to think of some others, but yeah, it's just there's lots of little wins and lots of just instilling it in the company culture. So it's been, it's something we're sort of continuing to work on.
Danielle, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. You sort of touched on this in the beginning, just in terms of your experience in coming to the States and what you found, and especially the New Yorkers. And John, I was just curious if you have any little insights in terms of just the differences in the US market compared to the UK market, now that I know you're playing in both for a little while now.
Is that to me or to
Yeah,
Amy?
to you.
Oh,
To
for
John.
me?
Yeah.
Well, look, I mean, one of the things is just basically how the advertising ecosystem is configured. Over there, I think, they have the ad association, they have some other groups around it. Here, it's very well understood that the IAB, the 4As, and the ANA, represent the sort of three corners of, three different core apertures that complement each other, representing, the advertising community here in the States. So it's incumbent on us to make sure that we're aligned with all three of them. So that's a slight difference just in terms of, making sure that we keep everybody, with the same sort of directional trajectory in the front visor. I think beyond that, there are some cultural differences, for a variety of different reasons. It does seem like the UK market is more, I think, aware of and educated around some of the core tenets of why reducing carbon is important and so on and so forth. Here in the States, we tend to be a little bit more, if it ain't clear and present danger, if I'm walking down Fifth Avenue and someone steps in my path and confronts me, that is a clear and present danger. I can deal with that. We're a little less good and able to sort of look at things over the horizon line, so to speak. So I think that's just a slightly different dynamic. We're also a very polarized society here. If I say to you, well, my name is John and I'm wearing a blue pullover, 50% of the United States would jump in and say, like, absolutely not. That's not blue. That's a shade of teal. Your name isn't really John. It's Oz. It's like, wait, whoa, holy cow. That's just a dynamic of the very robust and active and engaged world that is part of the United States. We tend to be fairly polarized here. Amy, I'm not sure if that dynamic is the same over in the UK. I kind of defer to you on that, but it is something that I'm very keenly aware of as it relates to the US marketplace.
No, I agree with that. I think that's a really interesting observation, actually.
Yeah. Sorry. So Danielle, any other questions?
We do. We've got one that's around the reduction versus offsets. Amy, I'm not sure if you can see that. It's very specific to programmatic ad impressions, and just figuring out how, as we as an industry, can start to figure out what those benchmarks and what the formula would be for that.
Yeah. So the comment from Andy. Yeah. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Andy. You need to focus on reduction, not offset. Like in the airline example, right? You don't want to just say carbon neutral tomorrow, but you haven't actually made any progress. You've still put out all of that damage into the atmosphere. You've just also done good somewhere else. And that, it's like having a smoothie after drinking 10 pints the night before, like you've still done damage. So making sure that our narrative is focused on reduction is absolutely key. And when it comes to reduction, as you've put in the comment there, Andy, one of the big factors is the amount of electricity and therefore the amount of CO2e that is emitted for each bid request. And if you imagine, one publisher might have 20 SSPs on average, perhaps 5 of them are in the header bidder. So every single ad on that publisher's page is going to have, possibly thousands, tens of thousands of bid requests for that one impression. And then also we're pulling in from the data suppliers and the consent management platforms, and there's so many different intermediaries that mean that each impression, it's easy to think of it as one linear chain, but actually each impression on a publisher's site, not only is there one ad that's served, but there's probably 10,000 ads that bid on this impression and still use the same amount of electricity and didn't win the bid. So that just gives you a little insight into the amount of carbon inefficiency in this system that we have built. There are other factors as well, though. So one big part is the actual weight of the file, the creative file, and how that is transferred across the wire. So, a tangible example of this is the font file. Many brands will have custom font, and a custom font sits as a file within the asset and is transmitted across that chain of suppliers. That custom font file goes to the DSP and the ad exchange and the SSP, and then onto the publisher, and then into the user's end device, and downloaded onto the user's device. That's a huge weight. And if you were to just take that custom font, compress it into a vector file, and then just layer it into the image, rather than carrying a font file across the internet, you use less data transfer, and therefore you use less electricity. And the asset looks the same. There's no change to the performance, there's no change to cost, there's no change to how the ad looks, but you've just taken, less electricity to push that ad across the internet. So there's how many jumps in the chain, there's how many bids were executed that didn't win, and there's also the weight of the file and how it's delivered across the internet. Is it downloaded or is it streamed? And how is it delivered onto the end user device? So it's a complex thing. There's lots of different parts to this picture, but I think, Andy, you've got a great point there, and I think understanding the simple carbon of a simple bid is a really great way of helping our industry understand the consequences of our actions.
That is such a smart question from Andy and such a smart answer. Thank you so much for that. Danielle, you want to bring us home?
Measure it.
How do we measure that?
Yeah, how do we measure that? And then there is one last question too around greenwashing too, which I think is an important one. So the last question from Andy is how might we measure that?
I feel like me and Andy are going to go for a coffee. This is a bigger conversation.
Bring us.
Yeah.
Well, this is where AdNet Zero comes in.
Yeah, there's lots of answers to that question, right? How do we measure it? It's that's what Good Loop does. It's what their Scope 3 are doing. It's what AdNet Zero, and I think the IAB standard is to create a universal measurement methodology, so that we, I mentioned earlier, we have this history of the viewability movement, right? The problem in the viewability movement is that for about 8 years, there was 10 different interpretations of what viewable meant. And so with one system, an ad was viewable, and with another system, it wasn't. That cannot happen here. That cannot happen here. We can't have a client see 2 different carbon numbers, because this is too important. If we start to undermine this movement with multiple measurements and multiple versions of the truth, then we will lose good faith and we will lose trust. So making sure that we all measure based on one based on one methodology, that's why it's so important that's driven by industry bodies, by third parties, by not-for-profits, by leaders in the industry that don't have a vested interest, but are pulling in all of the different perspectives.
And I might add that Andy and Duration Media are doing some amazing things as well, but I think you hit the nail on the head. If you got apples here and oranges there, those two don't gel together. So I think we do need to, as an industry, and this is where AdNet Zero really comes in, is to set more of a consistent framework so that the various measurements, across either verticals like our actions, production versus media versus events, or channels, or whatever it may be, from a media agency perspective or a more specialized company perspective, or even a client or another corporation, how can they measure in a more consistent way so that we can make more collective progress going forward? So thanks for the question, Andy. And then Danielle, you want to take it from A with the DA, Alex, our good friend Alex from overseas?
Alex, yep, absolutely. So the European Union has announced plans cracking down on greenwashing this week. How is the greenwashing conversation playing out in the US, and what advice would you give to advertisers worried about this?
Before Amy answers, let me just give a statement. We at AdNet Zero, we do not support greenwashing. We are anti-greenwashing. Hard stop. Amy, over to you.
Good Loop, also anti-greenwashing. Hard stop. I have a lot of clients come to us worried about this. So and I totally get it. It's terrifying to put your head above the parapet, to maybe get called out, to make yourself, in that vulnerable position. I totally understand why brands are concerned about it, and it is a valid and important concern. Greenwashing is extremely, extremely dangerous. It can overstate our progress, and then also it can really undermine our success, because if you hear that a brand is greenwashed, you suddenly lose faith in everything it said and all the progress it's made, and suddenly you feel, well, maybe I won't bother recycling because recycling's bullshit anyway, and suddenly we've lost another fighter in this fight, right? Like, greenwashing is so dangerous, and I think the ASA do a fantastic job of giving really clear guidelines. The number one thing with greenwashing is don't use complicated, convoluted terms. The ASA actually did a report recently. They found that the terms of carbon neutral, move to zero progress. There's lots of different sort of brands have tried to take the scientific term of net zero and then like owned it or like put their spin on it, and so they've like branded it, and then that just means it means nothing. It's just words, because it's not the scientific term, it's just marketing. So being careful with the use of the terms. If you're going to net zero, say net zero, and that means that you're going to reduce your emissions by 90% in a tangible time frame. If you're saying carbon neutral, say that, and that means that you've taken all of your emissions, your scope 1, your scope 2, and ideally your scope 3, and you've actually funded and measured the mitigating offset. Understand the terms you use and make sure that you use them correctly. It's really important. But also just not overstating our progress. John said this earlier, we are an industry that is built to differentiate. That's our literal job, is exaggerate the benefits and talk about how we're better than other people. That is what advertising is. And that is the worst thing you can do in a fight for the planet, because you will overstate your progress, you will exaggerate your role. A great example of greenwashing is a very, very ethical, brilliant company, Innocent. They sell smoothies, they're owned by Coca-Cola, but as a brand, they're very, very, they give 1% of their profits to charity, they use wholly natural ingredients, all this good stuff. They're a very nice, impressive company. They're owned by Coca-Cola, so I'm going to caveat that there are some broader issues about their ownership and, of course, the use of freshwater and plastics. Now, Innocent did a campaign recently that was talking about their smoothies and how good they are for you, because they're full of, fruit and veg, and how good they are for the planet because they've done a lot of work on using recycled plastics, etc. It's all well and good. It's a valid campaign about a company who I believe are making valid progress. However, they were called out for greenwashing because they implied that drinking a smoothie was actually good for the planet. And that's just categorically not true. Like, what's good for the planet is you pick an apple off a tree and you eat the apple, and you don't ever put it in a packet, and you don't ever put it on a lorry, and you don't ever put it in a machine. Like, that's a case of our industry getting a little bit too big for its boots. We are not actively good for the planet, and so just having a bit of humility and being really cautious with exaggeration or overestimation of our role is sort of the way I tend to caution our clients. And actually, the ASA are brilliant on this. They really are. Their guidelines are super helpful. They have a lot of they have a helpline you can call if you've got a piece of creative you want to run by them. So there's lots of resources out there.
That's awesome. Amy, thank you so much. This has been a riveting. I cannot believe how fast the time has flown here. I'm not really surprised, but because I know how dynamic and what a great leader you are, but this was really, really fascinating. And we've covered a lot of ground, from your historic move across the pond from the UK to the US. We still have some work to do. We're going to have to get rid of that whole lorry, the lorry reference. It's a freaking taxi cab. We're in New York City now. I'm just saying, At any rate, you're making amazing strides. You're doing great things. And I really love the momentum and the rocket ship that you're on. Please keep us posted. We look forward to doing more of these webinars for the benefit of all of our supporters, not only in the US, but from other parts of the world. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. And we'll give you a few minutes back in your day. But again, Amy, thank you so much. Danielle, thank you for assisting with some of the questions and helping us keep up. And we'll keep everyone posted on our progress for the good of the industry and for the good of the planet. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you soon. Be well, everyone. Take care.